Hello, this is Edward O'Daniel with a veteran landlord here for HUD Section 8 training. Right now, this training, the purpose of this is just really to give you, the landlord, a better understanding of what Section 8, what the program is, what it does, and just allows you to make a more intelligent choice in whether or not you want to utilize this program or not. Let's get going here. So the agenda, we're going to just go over what is Section 8. The Section 8 process is an overview, just how that whole process works from start to finish, how the Section 8 renewal process works, what the HAP contract is, and we'll get into what HAP means in a little bit, and then just some tips that I've come across the many years that I've been dealing with Section 8, just some of the do's, don'ts, tips, and tricks and stuff like that. So let's move forward here. Now, what is Section 8? The name Section 8 really came from the U.S. Housing Act of 1937, Section 8. There is a section of that Housing Act that governs a couple of different subsidy programs that the government has for low-income housing. Two of these programs, most people only realize that think that there's only one program, when actually there's two. One of them is called Housing Choice Voucher Program, and the other one is called a Project-Based Rental Assistance. Now, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the one we're going to talk about first, and it's the one that's most popular that people know about. What this program does is allows families to register with the local public housing agency, which is PHA. Now keep in mind, Section 8 will use several of these short acronyms for things. So PHA is Public Housing Agency, and we're going to cover a couple more of those, but I'll just be using PHA moving forward just to know that represents Public Housing Agency. So basically the PHA gives a voucher to a family who qualifies to allow them to go out and find a particular place owned by a private landlord to rent. Now, we'll get into some of the pros and cons of whether or not you want to use the program or whether or not you have to do that. If you can just, I know that's already got people's questions in their mind going, so if you can hold those, we'll answer all those here a little bit later on. But the Housing Choice Voucher Program is just that. It's just for people who have a voucher to go out and find a place in which the landlord will accept that voucher for rent and then move forward with renting to them. Now, the other program is project-based. This is where the landlord is contracted with a specific unit. Like, and just give an example, in my area, there's a 15-unit apartment complex that the owner has specifically put that as low-income housing. So what happens is that as those units become available, there are waiting lists from Section 8. Like Section 8 will actually have people waiting to get into these units because the owner has specified that all of the units in this complex will be part of this project-based. So anytime there's a vacancy, they have another person on the waiting list waiting to move in. Now, this thing has pros and cons with this, with the project-based. You might want to look into this, but I'll let you research that. But project-based is really I've seen that used a lot with multifamilies, not so much with single families. Single families, a lot of times, the Housing Choice Voucher Program works better for that. But in the project-based, basically there's an agreement between the PHA and the landlord to just continually move people into these units, and they're registered as just low-income housing. So again, they have a waiting list. As soon as there's a slot open, they will fill it automatically. So that is one advantage of using it, is that there is a waiting list, so you really don't have to wait at any time at all before that apartment is filled again or that home. Awesome. So Section 8 process overview. Let's kind of go over this from a high level. How does Section 8 work? How does the process begin? What are the steps involved? How does it end up? And just kind of go through it. Now, this right here, from a lot of people I've gone over, find is the most useful part of this. Now, the tips are going to be useful as well, but just to understand the Section 8 process and all the mechanical pieces involved is important, and that's what most people really want to know. So let's hop into it. So the landlord, let's just, again, forgive me, but this is very simple step by step. I don't mean to insult anybody here, but I'm just taking it step by step. Landlord posts the property for rent. So you start with your marketing. You post the property for rent. Now, when you post that particular property, inside of that little marketing section, your description that you post about the property, if you are going to allow Section 8, one of the things that you should do is put something like Section 8 allowed or Section 8 accepted in your marketing description. That right there will help you out immensely, because as you post this in a particular area in which Section 8 vouchers are allowed, you will get a lot of calls, contacts from people who say, you know, do you deal with the Section 8 program, or do you handle housing vouchers? One of those, it depends on what area, what market you're in. The terminology is a little bit different. But if you are going to do this, or if you're not going to do this, then you should put that in your marketing just to kind of help the number of calls that you're going to get. So the next thing is, let's just say you post the property, somebody from Section 8 contacts you. They contact you regarding the property. Hi, hello, you go back and forth. Prospect tenant wants to come see the property. It's just like anything else. They come see it, take a look at it. If they like the property and they want to move forward, the next thing that's involved is there's a packet. Oftentimes the terminology again for this varies between different parts of the country, but it could be called a welcome packet, a packet, move-in packet. People call it different things, but basically it is a stapled piece of paperwork with applications that you as a landlord need to sign and the tenant also needs to fill out. So these right here have to be filled out and have to be signed by both parties in order to proceed. So that's the first step. So if you're going to be dealing with Section 8 here, this is where I'm going to give you just a little quick tip. If you know a Section 8 person is coming to take a look at your property, make sure that they bring their packet with them when they take a look at the property. It just saves you time, because if they come take a look at it and said, yes, I like it, oh, but I left my packet at home, now you have to wait and kind of meet again. Whereas if they brought their packet with them, you may very well be able to fill that out while you're there at the property, get everything signed, and save yourself another trip. So let's move on here. So at this point, you've got the packet filled out, you've got it both signed, everything's ready to go. So you take the packet and you return it to the local public housing agency, the PHA, with a signed lease for both parties. Now, here's the one thing that people get confused about. In order for Section 8 to proceed, they typically do need to have a signed lease. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky. When you say a signed lease here, most people who have been in the business maybe a little bit will argue that, well, if I sign a lease, then I have to move them in, or they have the right to move in. This is something that Section 8 just requires. It is what it is. The lease is not valid unless Section 8 approves them to move into the unit, even though the lease is both signed by both parties. So it's not really complete until the PHA actually approves it. The tenant's allowed to move in and so forth, but they do, they meaning the PHA, does require you to have a lease in most parts of the country whenever you submit your packet paperwork, because they want to make sure this person's moving in. Now, some other questions. The leases are typically for 12 months at a time. So sometimes people ask, can Section 8 people go month to month? I've seen that happen, but not initially. So at the end of a 12-month lease, if a tenant needs a couple of more months, sometimes the PHA will work with them to only do a month by month for just a few months until they can move into a different place. That's really about the only time I've seen that. But for right now, 12 months at a time is how the PHA works. So they'll renew it every year at a time. Now, another quick tip right here real quick is, unless you generate a new lease with the tenant, every year, whatever that very first lease you sign initially, that lease will continue to just be renewed. Think of it just as that. You don't have to regenerate a lease every year for them. You don't have to, but you can, in case you want to change some of the terms of your agreement. But the same lease that you use will basically rotate through every year, even if they're there for 10 years. You'll use that same lease when they first signed up. So eventually, some of the things in your lease will change from year to year. You'll want to add different provisions or make changes based upon maybe laws that come out. So just remember that the lease can only really be generally updated on renewal period, or if both the landlord and the tenant agree. So just keep that in mind. So once you submit all that packet, the lease and everything, to the PHA receives it. They're going to process that packet. Next thing they're going to do is they're going to schedule an inspection of the property. So the inspector, there's going to, Section 8 or the PHA office has an inspection division that comes out and inspects the units. So the inspector is going to come out and they're going to go through the particular property. So when they go through the property, they may very well make notes of it. They're going to inspect it and make sure things are up to a certain quality of standard. It's called HQS, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on here. I'll give you a link to that. But there's a certain housing quality standard that has to be maintained by the PHA. Again, I know there's a lot of acronyms here, so sorry about that. But the inspector will hold the property to a certain standard. If there's things that need to be repaired, the inspector will make a note of it on their inspection report. Now, most Section 8 offices, or PHAs, forgive me if I keep using the term interchangeably, but most PHA offices have been going to technology. So the inspector may very well come out with a tablet and do the inspection, and then they'll post that on their system. And there's a whole other back-end electronic system that we'll talk about a little bit later on here about how you can access those systems. But everything's pretty much moving to digital with them because it's saving them so much money on paper and so forth that it's cost effective. But anyway, going back to the inspector, he will inspect. He'll give you a list. The list will actually be posted on your online portal, or either that or they'll email it to you. I think they'll do either one of those. But you'll have a list of items that you need to fix. Now, if you don't have a list, then great. You don't need to deal with that and so forth. But if you do have a list of items that you need to fix, then what you need to do is you need to have a handyman or yourself or somebody go out and correct all of these issues. And then you're going to have to call the office, the PHA office, and have it re-inspected when that's done. The inspector will then come back out, verify everything's been done, and then you're good to go. At that point, we can move on to the next step. So sometimes by the time the inspector comes out to actually have it re-inspected, this can actually be a couple of weeks. Okay? So one of the other things I've seen a lot with people not wanting to move forward with the Section 8 program is the initial time involved with getting a tenant move in. And I'm not going to joke with you. It could be 2 to 4 weeks. By the time it takes you start this process and get somebody moved in, it's not necessarily a very quick process for this across the country. Some places are better than others, but for the most part, the PHAs are going off of a limited government budget, so they only have so many people, and depending upon the demand for that area, they may be stretched a little bit thin. So an inspection, typically in my area, could take 7 to 10 business days before they actually come out to actually do the initial inspection, and then they're pretty good with following up with the secondary inspection if necessary, in just maybe a day or two. But that right there has to be done according to the PHA office. They have to inspect it, make sure it's up to HQS standards. Once they do, it passes, then at that point we can move on. Okay, but the inspection period could take just a little bit, just to give you a heads up about that. Now, once the property is passed, the PHA office, there's a person in their office that handles rent negotiation. So the PHA office, sometimes they'll negotiate, but sometimes they're just like, here's the amount of rent that we can pay. Now, let's just say that you have a place and you've got it out at fair market rent. You've got it placed for fair market rent based upon, there's several things that go into the rent on this one, by the way. When it comes to how Section 8 governs rent, it goes back to how many bedrooms you have, what utilities, if any, you're including with the rent, amenities, does it have the obviously stove and refrigerator, but does it have a dishwasher, does it have a microwave, are you including electric, are all utilities included? Obviously, depending upon some of those answers, Section 8 can pay more for the rent than if they were not included. So they'll negotiate with you to see how much rent they can pay you based upon their sort of standard, their tools, and what they've been paying for the same type of market property in the same market. So now, when you get this, you can certainly sit back and say, no, I'm not going to accept that. Or if they offer you what you're asking for, then great, you can move on. Okay, but they're not going to pay you more than what you're asking. That's one thing that you might want to consider about this is sometimes you might just take your luck at pushing the rent up a little bit. If you're renting these, this is just a little tip. I have been guilty of doing this before, trying to get a little bit more. If they say no, okay, let's just say it's $1,000. You might push it to $1,100. They might come back and say, no, all we're going to offer you is $1,000. Well, if $1,000 is what you're looking for anyway, great. But they might come back and say, okay, we'll offer you $1,030. Okay, in which case that's $30 more than what you would have settled for. So it'd be better for you anyway. So that's just something to consider here when it comes out. But they will negotiate with the rent on you, and you do not have to accept it. As a landlord, you don't have to say, okay, this is all I'm going to get. Then fine, if I want to use this program, that's all I'm going to get. Well, for that particular unit, that's all you may get. But you do have the right to say no and move on and continue to market your property to other people. So that's just something I wanted to make sure you understand. You do have the right to accept or deny based upon the rent amount offered. But let's just say they offered you what you were asking for and you wanted to move on. Okay, if you do accept, then the PHA office will finalize the paperwork and they'll generate a housing assistance program. This is that HAP acronym that we talked about earlier, Housing Assistant Payment Contract, that must be signed and returned by both parties. Okay, sometimes Section 8, depending on where you're at throughout the country, will also include other special addendums to your lease. So just automatically assume this. This is for their best practice and best standard. One of the things I know they've pretty much tried to push in every particular lease is lease addendums regarding domestic violence and how domestic violence won't be tolerated and things like that. So you may end up having to do that. And sometimes they actually put that in your packet of information that you turn in the very beginning. So you might actually see that in the packet, but they may include them depending on your area. They might have special things they put in there. Just want to make sure that you're aware of that. Now, once you have the HAP and you sign it and you return it, once signed and returned, the caseworker, now that's another term you may hear, the caseworker is the person who is assigned to that particular tenant to handle their paperwork in the office. And a caseworker may be assigned 100, 200 different tenants to process their paperwork. So, I mean, these people can be quite busy and overworked depending on the need in that particular area. But the caseworker is the person that will get that request back and they'll issue a move-in slip. This is an official notice from the PHA office that this person has been processed and this tenant has been processed and is now allowed to move into your unit with the agreed upon rent, conditions, and everything else that was discussed. So that right there, until you, the landlord, get this, you will not be authorized to move that person in. So you need the move-in slip that they get from them. Typically in my area, they actually use the pink slip. So that's kind of what they termed it. It's like a 3-copy piece of paper. You had white, yellow, and pink carbon paper, and then the white and yellow were torn off, and the tenant got the pink copy, and then that was their move-in slip. I think they've changed it, but that's just the things that you kind of pick up when dealing with Section 8 a lot, just some funny things. But that is needed before they move in, okay? Now, one of the things I do want to make sure that you understand, whenever a tenant moves in here, typically it is our policy, or my policy, that when a tenant moves in, regardless of when they move in throughout the month, they need to pay the entire first month's rent. Okay, I've had some bad experiences where people try to get in at the end of the month and try to move into my property light, meaning they don't have to pay that much money in rent. If they move in, if there's only 30 days in a month and they move in on the 28th, some people prorate that, and then they only have to pay 2 days rent, which could be whatever, $100, whatever, $50 or $80 or $100 to move in, as well as their security deposit. Well, if they move in, I want to make sure they have enough money to make sure they move in for myself. So I require the first month's rent and the security deposit myself. But Section 8 does not work that way. If you want to use Section 8, they will only give you a prorated amount. And typically, they take about 30-day turnaround time. Depending on where you're at in the month, they may take another 30 days to actually start paying you. So if somebody's moving in at the 20th of the month, then you typically the payments come out on the 1st or 2nd of the month for Section 8, like the rest of the payments that will hit your account somewhere on the 3rd or the 4th. But they may not, depending on how busy the office is and the caseworkers, they may not get your paperwork done and pushed through their system in time for the financial person to actually make a payment to you on the 1st or 2nd. So typically the PHA office, they will actually make 2 payments each month. They'll make a payment. There's a payment that comes out on the 1st and typically a payment that comes out in the middle of the month, just so they can make sure that somebody doesn't have to wait a full 30 days to get paid. But just to give you a heads up, it can take you a little bit of time for them to start paying you, but they will pay you all the money they owe you at one time. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but they do not give you the first month's rent up front. They will prorate the first month, whatever that payment is, and then they'll start making you the next payment, the full payment the next month. So that right there is the Section 8 process as an overview, just from starting to market your property, to go through everything, and what is it going to take to get to the end to move somebody in. So this process, again, may very well take up to 30 days, 4 weeks or so, to get somebody moved in. Now, this is one of the things, if you're willing to wait, the benefit of this, obviously, with using the Section 8 program, is that it's government-funded checks. So you're going to get your money every month, whatever that payment is, each and every month. Now, we're going to talk about, some people may have questions regarding, well, how much does Section 8 pay versus how much does the tenant pay? We're going to go over that a little bit later on when we talk about the HAP contract. So we'll kind of talk about how that gets broken down and so forth. But for now, the process overview is just what I wanted to go over. And hopefully you guys have a good understanding now of what that process is and how it works. Now, one of the new things that you're going to have to deal with is the renewal process. Let's just say you do move a Section 8 person in. Let's just say they've been in there for a while. What happens then? What happens when you with the lease renewal? Is there anything that the landlord needs to do? How does that process work? So the point of this training is to let you know what is going to happen before it happens to you so you can expect it. So here's what we got. Section 8 renews their lease every year. Okay, they are going to send an inspector out. Typically, they inspect the units. It depends on certain offices, but sometimes they come out anywhere between 3 to 5 months before the lease expires is what they try to do. They'll try to come out early. They're going to inspect the unit. Now, this is one thing that you don't have to be a part of. That's a great thing. You get notified of when the inspection is, but it's the tenant's responsibility to be there for that inspection. Now, it is your right as a landlord to be there as well, but it's not your responsibility to be there, just to make sure that's clear. So the tenant will be there. They need to have somebody there to let the inspector in to inspect the unit. Now, when they inspect it, just like the first time, the inspector may very well have items that are in the property that need to be fixed and maintained. Well, the inspector does not care if that's, and I say that lightly, it's just the inspector's job is to point out the things that need to be corrected. It's not the inspector's job to say whose job it is to fix it. The PHA office simply just pushes all of those responsibilities to the owner. Regardless if it could be something as simple as the house is dirty and needs to be cleaned. Well, again, that's not, you as a landlord, that is not your responsibility. That would be the tenant's responsibility to do so. But the PHA office makes it the owner's responsibility to handle it. So then as the landlord, you now have to delegate that to tenants to make sure that if there's anything that's their responsibility, that they fix that prior to the next inspection time. So one of the things that's very important to understand about here is the word abatement. Okay, that's another word that you're going to hear from PHA offices. So if they come out to inspect and they give you a list of so many items, and they'll give you a deadline. Here's the date. Typically it's about 3 weeks or so. I'm going to be back out in 3 weeks to re-inspect, and you have that amount of time to get these items fixed and repaired. If those items are not done by the time the person comes back out, the inspector will put your property into a status of abatement. Now, abatement with Section 8 just means that they're not going to pay you the Section 8 or the government portion of that subsidy each month until these items are corrected. And that only makes sense. I mean, right now it's just their goal to make sure that the houses that are in the Section 8 program, they're just well maintained. So as long as you, the owner, either get them corrected, have the tenant fix whatever they need to fix, as well as maybe hire a handyman or contractor, as long as those items are done before the inspector comes back out, the inspector will pass them all. It won't go into abatement and you won't have a problem. Now, the one thing I do want to talk about as far as abatements go, here's another misconception, that once you're in abatement, once you get those items fixed, that now the Section 8 program of the PHA office will now release those funds to you. And that is not true at all. So if you're in abatement, that means they will not pay you, period. It's not like they're holding the payment till you correct it. You do not get the payment. So depending on how much they're paying you, you may lose that entire payment for that month if you don't get them fixed, if that makes sense. So just make sure that whenever that happens, that you just get all the items fixed within the time frame allowed, and you won't have that problem. But typically people think that with abatement, as long as I get them fixed, then Section 8 will send me the remainder of the money. It's like they're holding it till I get it fixed, and that's not true. So one of the other things that I want to tell you as landlords that people have questions about is, well, how does the renewal process work? And each year during the renewal process, with that lease that renews every year, this is your opportunity to hop in and actually get the tenant to sign a new or updated lease. This is the perfect time to do so. So you would simply go, you would get your new lease signed, that lease and any addendums and so forth within that, a copy of that has to be mailed to the caseworker in the PHA office because they need to get an updated copy of the lease as well. But as long as they have a copy, you can update this lease every single year yourself. Again, if you don't update the lease, your existing lease that they have on file will continue to renew. That's how this works. So moving forward here with the lease renewals, what if you want to do a rent increase? Yes, Section 8 allows for rent increases, and you can request a rent increase each year. It doesn't mean that it's going to get approved. It just means that you're allowed to request it. However, because the PHA office does receive so many requests from people, that they do ask that that gets put in enough time for them to process it. Typically, you can check your local PHA office, but it's about 3 months. So 3 months before your lease renewal comes in, there is a rent increase form that most offices have that you have to fill out and then submit to them. Now, most of these offices are technical, so you don't have to like physically hand paperwork to them. You can always do that, go into the office and hand it to them. But most of the caseworkers are getting to more technology based. So if you can fill it out, scan it to an email, like a PDF, and email it to the caseworker, that would work just fine as well and save you some time. So that's a helpful little tip. But just check with the office and make sure they do that. Most caseworkers also have their own fax numbers now with technology, so if you want, you can just send them a fax and then they'll get it directly in their mailbox as well. So typically about 3 months, fill out the rent increase paperwork. It's just one sheet of paper. It shouldn't be very much at all. Submit it, and then now your request has been put in. If it goes through and it gets approved, you will be notified. If it doesn't, you will be notified. That's the good thing about that. But if you miss that window, there's only about, I dare to say, 2 to 4 week window that the caseworker has to submit, that you have to get these rent increases in by. And if you do not get it in, if you submit it early, they will not accept it. So you can't submit it like 5 months early and then just ask the caseworker to keep it. They won't do that. It has to be submitted within a small window of time that they have to submit the rent increase, and it cannot be submitted late. If it is, they will just ignore it. And a lot of times these people are so busy, they won't even let you know that it's been ignored. You won't get notified of your rent increase, and it might irritate you a little bit. So just keep in mind, find out from your PHA office when these rent increases timeframes are, and just make sure you put that on your calendar. You know, if your lease renewals are going to renew at a certain time, just post that date. You know, put it on your calendar, 9 months or 10 months out, whatever that is, and put that on the calendar. Request rent increase for this particular property address, and then that way you don't have that problem. Awesome. So that's the renewal process. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, but there is a process that you have to go through with the renewals every year. And pretty much, like I said, every year the renewals are for 12 months at a time. They don't do 24 months. They don't do longer leases, 12-month leases. And then again, I have seen them do month to month if somebody's looking to move, but only in the short term. Like, I've never really seen them go beyond about 3 months of month to month before that the tenant has to go find another place and get a 12-month lease. So great. So now let's talk about the HAP contract. Now your HAP contract, this right here is the main contract as a property owner and a landlord that you have with the PHA office. This governs sort of the rules and relationship of how things are going to happen and how things are done. And I'm going to take a minute and actually show you a blank copy of a HAP contract that I got off of HUD's website. It's just the newer one. Everybody can go get it and download it. But we're going to go through it a little bit and just kind of show you what it looks like. Just show you some sections here. I advise you to read it if you want to. I believe it's about 12 pages. Not all of it just text, some of it's forms, but please read it, understand what that is if in your particular area to make sure that you are understanding of what the rules are. And I'll explain some of the things that could be gotchas on this. So with the HAP contract, one of the things that the PHA, they do have the right inside of the HAP contract to terminate the Section 8's payments for the tenant if the tenant violates the HAP contract. So let me just kind of say, that's one of the things that I like to tell people right up front, because this is a possibility. Now, let me stress this. PHA is not in the habit. I've never had them just purposely go and say, willy-nilly, we're canceling a contract. The only time I've seen them do this is when, like, the tenant has committed, like, financial fraud. Because in this particular prospect, with the PHA office, the subsidy that the government pays and the tenant pays is based upon how much money they make. Typically, if they make so much money, then they pay more for their rent and the government pays less. That just makes sense. Now, at some point there is, and I don't have a number for you on this one, but at some point when you make so much money, you no longer qualify for the Section 8 program. You, in a sense, are not considered low income at that point. So then at that point, you are removed from the Section 8 program, and then your voucher that you have, which is your placeholder, your slot, or your position in the program, now becomes freed up and available, and the person on the waiting list is now allowed to come in and utilize that. This is one of the ways that people can exit from the Section 8 program, in a good way, that they earn more money, they find a better job, and then they don't need Section 8 any longer, or they don't qualify. But sometimes people will make more money, but then they'll report less. So they're committing fraud when they do that. You're not allowed to go out and make a lot of cash behind the scenes at cash jobs and then try to stay on the Section 8 program. It's just against their rules. So if I've seen it happen where if they catch that, if the PHA office catches them in fraud, then they will issue a termination for this person. Like, this person has violated the agreement that they have with the PHA office, so that the PHA office will terminate any government subsidy money then coming for that particular person. Now, what happens with that is the PHA office will now not be involved with you and the tenant whatsoever. It is now you as a landlord's responsibility to charge them the full amount of rent. So you get no subsidy. The tenant will have to pay the full amount. You'll have to evict them to get them out if they don't, or something like that. But now you'll have to get involved. The one thing that I want to make sure that it's clear is Section 8 will not be a mediator. They will not act on the landlord's behalf or even on the tenant's behalf regarding stuff. Only in very few cases. So if you have a problem with the tenant, if the tenant's violating your lease, this is not something that are very particular things. Like, if the tenant's not paying their portion, then yes, they're violating the HAP contract. And then, because that's a portion of the HAP contract, that then you can go back to their caseworker and say the tenant is not paying their portion of the rent. And then the caseworker is then obligated to send a notice to the tenant requesting that they pay the rent. Otherwise, they will be eliminated from the Section 8 program, because that's one of the tenant's responsibilities in the contract, is to do that, to pay their portion of the rent. So anything else, however, like anything, if they're, for instance, not cutting the grass, if it's a single family and you have them taking care of the grass or things like that, or maybe they're partying and making loud noises and things like that, Section 8 is not getting involved with that. That's something that they consider to be a landlord-tenant dispute, and they are out of that. So you'll have to handle that yourself. So there are some things that you can get the PHA office involved with to help you out with, but then other things that you can't. So from the tenant side, if the landlord is not keeping up with maintenance, or if things are broken and not being fixed, then that's where the landlord is violating the HAP contract by not keeping it to HQS standards, in which case now the caseworker will notify the landlord that the tenant has made a dispute and that the landlord is now responsible for going over and getting that fixed. And if not, then they'll put your property into abatement. So that's pretty much how that works. That's one of the biggest things I want to make sure when you sign this, that the PHA office can cancel their agreement with this. So I need you to understand what your responsibilities are, what PHA's responsibilities, and what the tenants are. So PHA would rather not get involved with any landlord-tenant disputes. They just say, if you have a dispute, you take that to court, you handle it, but they're not involved with that. Now, the owner must, in the part of the HAP contract, the owner must maintain the property to housing quality standards, HQS. So I just gave you a link here. If you just search for housing quality standards, you'll probably find and get this link that's up in here. It's just a link that came from HUD about here's some of the inspection forms and things that they look for, just to give you some more information, but we won't be going over all of that stuff here on this particular presentation. However, I do want to at least go over the HAP contract a little bit. I'm going to pop over here and bring this up. So this right here is the HAP contract and agreement that we have, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development here. So Section 8 Tenant-Based Assistance Program, Housing Choice Voucher Program. So we're not going to go over all of this, but basically this is a form that will need to be filled out. So things like where it says enter tenant's name, things like that, enter the address of the unit, these would be filled out when you get the HAP contract from the PHA office. Some of the things I want to make sure that you understand is that they'll fill out the initial lease terms here, the first date and the last date of the lease contracts. So all of that stuff will be involved here. But the biggest thing that they want to understand here as part of this HAP agreement is having the tenant information, the unit information, and then the lease terms, the initial rent to owner. So this initial rent amount right here that'll go in this section, this is typically that prorated amount if they move in. This is how much of that rent that you'll get paid initially for their move-in date. And then initial housing assistance, this will be how much they're paying you per month, for their portion of the rent. So in this case, if the rent is $1,000 and this says $500 per month, then $500 is how much the PHA office is paying, and then the tenant will also pay $500 toward their portion. So this right here really just strictly says how much the PHA office is paying you. Here's one of the things that I wanted to sit back and explain to you. It's just a very simple diagram that you need to have filled out initially. And sometimes this form will actually be in your packet that you fill out initially. So it's pretty straightforward here. For heating, you're just going to be filling in what type of heating it is throughout your country. Depending on where you're at, you could be oil, you could be natural gas, you could even be coal. But your heating, your cooking, your water, you need to fill out what type it is. Now, this provided by. Provided by is just going to be simply, if you look at it, it's going to be an O for owner and a T for tenant. So it'll just be TO, OT, whatever it is. Those are the only two initials that you'll see specifying who will provide this. So when it talks about provided, basically right here, it's like who will provide this information. So you don't necessarily say providing heat. The tenant is not providing the heat. Typically where you'll see that at is like with the air conditioning. You can say air conditioning, this might be a T here if you don't have air conditioning and the tenant has to bring their own. But if the landlord is providing the air conditioning, like window units or a central AC system, that this would be provided by as an O. Refrigerator, is it the tenant bringing theirs or is the landlord providing a refrigerator? So then this would be a T or an O. The biggest column I want you to keep in mind here is the paid by. So provided just means whose job is it to provide that particular appliance. Refrigerator, range, microwave, things like that. Who's providing it? Most of the time, the refrigerator and the stove is provided by the landlord or O. Air conditioning, O. But trash collecting, we don't have to worry about that. You don't have to provide trash collection because that's going to be a company that does that. So really what you need to look for is what's paid by. So who's paying for heating? Is it going to be a T or is it going to be an O? That depends upon if that utility is included with the rent or if the tenant's responsible for paying for that utility. So typically, again, you would just go down here, T or O, T or O, T or O, all the way down. Now, typically with certain places, depending on how things are metered, if it's an individual single family home, then you may very well be able to get away with the water and the sewer or with the wastewater being paid for by the tenant. But in multifamily buildings where there's only one water line coming in and one sewer line going out, typically the water and the sewer are paid for and even the trash by the owner. So you just want to make sure you go down this column and put T's and O's where appropriate, because whatever you put in on this particular agreement is what sticks. These are the things that are looked at whenever rent is the rent price is governed. So if you're including lots of utilities, if you include all the utilities and paying for all of them, then Section 8 will give you more rent. But if you expect the tenant to pay for these, then they're going to give you less rent. So you just need to make sure that you adjust your rent accordingly. So this is where you need to come down and get this stuff signed. Now, a couple of other things here I wanted to point out. Just the term of the contract, leasing. You see, it's not very hard to read. Maintenance, just say that the owner must maintain the contact unit in accordance with the HQS standards. So just follow that website. Look down through here. When it says reasonable rent. So again, you can't, if your apartments or house would rent for $1,000 a month, you can't charge $1,800. Even though it's trying to use a government program, because they will tell you that it needs to be reasonable rent, market rate. Otherwise, they won't give you what you're looking for with that. You might get a little bit higher depending on how nice the place is. If it is really If it's remodeled and has like, newer kitchens, newer flooring, things like that, then of course the price on that you can ask is a little bit higher than something that had not been renovated. So this is where it goes, PHA payments to the owner. For the most part, PHAs have been becoming more technology driven, as I've said. Payments come to you with direct deposit. They do not mail out checks any longer for these. It has to be direct deposit into your particular account, which is not a problem for most people. And then if you want to find out what payments were sent to you, you would log into your online portal that they gave you through the PHA office, and you would see all of your distributions. Some people have it differently. It's called ledgers in some systems and distributions in others. So you would simply be able to look at that and so forth. Let's see. Owner's breach of the HAP contract. So here's one of those things where if they did breach it, what's required. This is why it's just so important to read this. But other than the items that you saw up above, those items will automatically be filled out with the HAP contract. But these are all the things as we scroll down, what happens if the property gets foreclosed on, things like that. So this right here is basically the HAP contract that you have. So looking to see what are some of the other things that pop out here. Utilities and appliances. This is, again, another one. It's like family damage. The owner is not responsible for the breach of HQS because of damages beyond normal wear and tear. You're going to see language like that in this HAP agreement just because the PHA office does not want you, the landlord, coming back after them as like, well, they broke my stove. That's something that the landlord and the tenant has to come out with. If the tenants abuse your stove or they broke it or something like that from just neglect and abuse, then that's not something, for instance, that the PHA office is going to be involved with. That's one of those things that is a landlord-tenant dispute, and you need to handle that yourselves. They won't come in the middle of that. There's just, again, very few things that they'll hop in and do things only if they violate this particular agreement. So anyway, this right here is just a real quick thing that I want to come up with here, criminal activity and alcohol abuse. So one of the things you might want to think about is if you're constantly getting police calls, for like drunk and disorderly, or if somebody likes to be a power drinker or something at one of your properties and police are getting called and there's domestic violence involved, then the PHA office, if they find out about that through like the tenant, if they say, hey, the police have been out, my husband's been drinking and abusive, they will end this particular contract, even though you didn't do anything. It's something that they did, but then that will now put you in a situation where you have to respond, and you'll have to go out and do something with this particular tenant, whether it be, move the person out or do something, but it'll cause a financial strain for you, the landlord. So a couple of things here. Protection of victims of abuse. They're really big about that, just domestic violence, abuse, that there's more federal mandates that are coming down for that, for housing. So here are just some of the definitions. Please read all of these in this particular HAP contract. So that right there is the HAP agreement. So just read that, please. That is your main agreement that between you, the tenant, and the PHA office to let you know what your rights are and what's going to happen. Okay? So next is just getting into some of the tips here. These are where the years of experience come in to tell you what to do, what not to do, and things like that. This is what a lot of newbie landlords violate, or they don't know whether they're true or not. So I'm going to go over each one of these. Landlord is not allowed to collect more rent from the tenant than the HAP contract states. Here's what happens, and what I've seen a lot of. Let's just say you have, and I'll use the example where you're trying to rent your single family residence for $1,000 a month. Well, what if Section 8 or the PHA office says, well, we'll only pay you $900. Okay, and then what happens, the tenant comes to you and they say, oh, I really love this property. It is so great. I tell you what here, I'll just pay an extra $100 each month to give you the $1,000. And then that way we don't have to get them involved. Okay, first of all, this is not criminally illegal, but it is illegal in a violation of the HAP contract. And if you're caught, or if the tenant ever turns you in, or that a PHA office finds out about this, that you're collecting more money than what they've authorized that unit to pay, then you will be terminated and not allowed to use the Section 8 program any longer. So just keep that in mind. That could, burn a bridge for you, and it's really not worth it for this. But if you're a landlord, again, you cannot collect more than what Section 8 says. That's why it's so important to negotiate that rent price to get what you want up front. So please don't do that. I've seen people do it. And the problem with that is that even, let's just say the tenant comes back and says, I'll pay that extra $100. Well, what happens if 2 or 3 months down the road, they stop paying that $100? Okay, now you as a landlord, you're going to be upset because this person violated your agreement that you had within each other, but it's not enforceable. You have nothing. There's nothing in your lease that says that this will rent for $1,000, because if the PHA office says that it only rents for $900, then that's what the lease that you have with them says. It only rents for $900. It doesn't rent for $1,000. So you can't evict them. You can't take them to court for not paying that $100. And it may very well irritate you in the long run. So it's just not really worth it. Get the rent that you're looking for, and don't play that game. Next is landlord and tenant issues will be handled between themselves, and Section 8 is not a mediator. I think I kind of beat that one up a little bit earlier here. That, again, there are very, very few things here that are done if the house is dirty, poor housekeeping, if the tenant attracts bugs and roaches, if they don't cut the grass, I mean, you name it. All these things like this is a landlord-tenant dispute. Okay, these type of things have to be handled between you and the tenant. The Section 8 office does not really care about it. They're not going to get involved with it, only if it violates your initial agreement of the tenant not paying their portion of the rent, however small that is. Now, I've seen tenants that have 100% paid by the PHA program. That they'll pay the entire rent for the full month. That's perfectly fine. But I've seen, even as low as $20. But people don't make their $20 payment every month, thinking that, oh, it's just $20. What does the landlord care? So, I mean, believe it or not, if they don't make that payment, that is an evictable offense. I mean, they're not paying their portion of the rent. So you at least have that as a right as well. If the unit is an abatement, then PHA will not pay their portion of the rent until defects are corrected. These payments are lost and will not be paid back to you upon correction. Again, I think I kind of beat that one up earlier about abatement. I'd like to bring that up because that's something that's serious, and when people lose money, it could be quite a bit of money. I mean, the amount of money that you lose in that Section 8 payment could be more than what it costs you to get those little items fixed. So, I mean, it might cost you, let's just say $500 to get it fixed, but you're losing $1,000 in rent because you didn't pay $500 to get it fixed. It only makes sense just to get them fixed. So please keep that in mind. Most PHAs are an electronic system which provide you, the landlord, a portal to see the payments and other communications generated by PHA, such as inspection reports. So typically when you go through and they have the inspection report, it typically takes a day. The inspector will go back to the office and get everything resubmitted, and then that inspection report will then be posted to your online portal the next day. It'll be available. You can click on it. You can download it. You can see the things that have passed, the things that have failed, stuff like that. So it is very nice that they've done that. That it makes it very easy to check on your properties, and it just makes it easier. So the last one here is tenants are required to make their portion of the rent payment regardless of how small it is. Even if they don't, then you can evict them. Okay, now you may not want to evict them because that has a cost and a certain vacancy rate and things like that. But if they're not paying their portion of the rent, this is something, instead of going after them for $20 a month, which I know seems petty, but I would have to, as a landlord, have you strictly enforce if they owe $20, then you expect $20 to be paid on time every single month without recourse. I mean, that's what you expect. Don't give in to them, because every little thing that you give in to them over, a couple of months to a year, what if they stay there several years? Well, what are they going to be asking you to do in a couple of years? So just stay strict on your payment methods and charge them late fees. They may owe you $20 a month, but your late fee may be, I don't know, $50. $50 for a late fee. Well, if they don't pay the $20, now they owe you $70 because now they have to pay a late fee. So if they don't make that payment, that is something that you can get the PHA office involved with and have them written up with that. And believe me, one of the things that are people who are on the Section 8 program, the waiting list to get into these programs literally are years, multiple years, not just 6 months. I mean, it could take you 8 to 10 years in some places to get on this list, wait on that list to get on this program. So once you're on, you don't want to lose that voucher by violating any rules. If the caseworker, if they habitually don't make their payments, then they can be kicked out of the Section 8 program. So that is a right of you as a landlord to do, and you can go after them for that. Now, one of the things I want to bring up here is something that I've seen across the country here lately. Landlords may or may not have a choice on whether to accept Section 8 program. Now, you look at that and you just might be going, WTF, just right in your head. You might be just looking just like, what? And right now, what I've seen is a lot of landlords, the argument is this. People with Section 8 vouchers are not allowed to move into nicer areas where the market rents are higher and the school districts are typically better. Typically, it involves school districts. So they're not allowed to get their kids into the better school districts because the landlords who own those properties will not accept Section 8 voucher programs because, in a sense, they don't need to. I mean, there's probably such a high demand for those apartments that as soon as you put it up on the market, within a week, you have it rented to somebody with a, good solid job, making a lot of money, very good credit score. And you don't have to worry about these people paying their rent because, you're going to get it every month. Well, one of the problems with that is some of the council people, the legislators, and some of the local cities and things across the country are trying to implement a program where they're basically taking the fair housing law that was established in the early 1970s through the federal government and then extend that program to include financial part of that. Like, you cannot say you're not going to accept Section 8 program because they don't make enough money. So one of your tenant requirements, and that we have a whole other training regarding tenant requirements on the Veteran Landlord site to go check that out. But one of your requirements may be that somebody makes a certain amount, certain times the monthly rent. Like, there's an industry standard roughly of around three times the monthly rent every month, just to make sure that you can afford the place. That way, your rent payment is really only about a third of your total, money that you make. So the other 2/3 you can use to live off of. Well, what if a Section 8 person only makes, for instance, one times the monthly rent? Then you can just simply say, well, you don't make enough money, so I deny you with that. Or, no, I don't want to accept the program because I don't need to. Well, I would advise you to look into your local office before you do this, because if you are becoming a landlord, there are certain parts of even my local area where we cannot say no to Section 8 tenants. If we do, it is a violation of the fair housing law that has been modified by that local city, and then that can be a finable offense. You can be fined and even potentially sued, believe it or not, for violating fair housing law with that. So just check into that. I don't want to scare you. I just simply want to educate you that these restrictions may be out there already, and just to make sure that you know about them. And if you do know about them, know how you could potentially work with them or work around them. Maybe find some additional people who have handled that situation, some other landlords, and how they handle this. But I just want to make sure that you're aware that there are some cities that are requiring that landlords take low-income housing in multiple areas to give people with vouchers a fair opportunity to rent property, even in the better areas, so to speak. So, next one here is landlords do not get assigned or have to take a particular tenant just because they're using the HUD Section 8 program. This is one of the biggest things, the biggest misconceptions that I've heard with people who are using the Section 8 program. Just like, oh, no. I don't want to use the Section 8 program because then the Section 8 program is going to tell me who I have to take and I may not like them. That is not true at all. Now, if you remember, there was 2 programs, the Housing Choice Voucher Program and the other program. Of course, it slipped my mind right now, but the other program is the one where, again, where it's the Section 8 program will assign somebody to you, but a lot of these things have gotten restricted. They understood that landlords just don't want to be assigned somebody, that they want to make sure that they have the right to have that person fill out an application. They want to check the background. They want to make sure, for instance, what if it's a violent felon or a sex offender? You know, you don't necessarily have to take that particular person. Those aren't protected classes, at least right now, that I know about within the United States area. So you don't have to take somebody. That's the whole point of this. You can have them apply. You can say whether or not you want them or don't want them, strictly based upon their application. Okay? So they don't just tell you you have to take this person if you want to be on the program. Just want to make sure that you know you have that right. Next one is the PHA makes the landlord maintain the property to HQS standards. The landlord's responsibility to inform the tenant of any of those items that might be responsible for. So we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, that if you receive an inspection report, or if the PHA office goes out for an inspection and they note some things, that if these are the tenant's responsibility, like let's just say, heaven forbid, the tenant has a kid and the kid was playing ball in the house and broke a window. You know, they kicked the ball, boom, broke a window, and the tenant has a board up or something up over the window, and the inspector says you need to fix that window. Well, that is something, of course, that if the tenant broke, then they are responsible for fixing. So you can tell the tenant that they're going to be responsible for that payment, even though you as the owner or the landlord may have to come in and actually get the repair done just to make sure the unit does not go into abatement over there, because you need to get these items fixed. But again, if the tenant is responsible for these things, then they either need to correct them or they need to pay to have them corrected. Okay, now this is the final thing here. We're almost done here. Hold on with me. But any lease amendments or addendums that you actually configure on the lease after the initial move-in, the PHA office has to get a copy of those. Okay, because realistically, they need to make sure that they don't really care what goes back and forth between the landlord and the tenant. You know, they're not going to restrict you from doing different addendums and things like that. But what they want is they want to make sure they have a copy so that they understand, you know, the agreement between the landlord and the tenant. So that's really the biggest thing there. So guys, that's about it. I just want to say thanks, guys and gals, for tuning into the HUD Section 8 training. I hope this was useful for you. And just remember, visit veteranlandlord.com, where landlords go to learn. Have a great day.